I do want to get back into a big story that we have been covering as we continue to learn new details about the Long Island architect charged with murder in the Gilgo Beach killings. We had some video that actually showed the suspect a bit earlier, Rex Heuermann from our Fox 5 New York team, and this is some other video from outside his home. The 59-year-old is accused of killing 3 of the 11 victims and is considered to be, quote, the prime suspect in the death of another woman, according to police. I want to talk more about this case as new information just continues to come out here. Stuart Kaplan is a former FBI agent and is here live. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Good morning.
Good morning. So first off, we learned about the arrest early on Friday. I do want to get your kind of reaction since this is such an infamous case. What was going through your mind when you heard that an arrest had been made?
You know, quite frankly, with the advancement of forensic science and also with respect to the advancement of what law enforcement can do with cellular data, there are very few crimes in this day and age that can go unsolved. Now, with that being said, if we could get local police departments the proper funding and resources, and that's really what you saw in this particular case. You saw a regrouping of local, state, and federal parts coming together, utilizing their assets, and it is not surprising to me that this case finally, a decade later, led to the apprehension of this individual.
We did get a lot of information here about Rex Heuermann. We know that he is an architect there in Long Island. It sounds like he was pretty well known, especially in his own community, and lived across the bay from where the bodies were found there. Is there anything to you specifically based on your experience there that has stood out to you about what we have learned in the last few days about him?
Well, I mean, certainly it's a made for movie type of scenario with respect to literally from the outside looking in, having what appears a professional, married with 2 children, living in a bedroom community out Long Island and seemingly living a normal life. But with that being said, I think now that the curtain has been pulled down and you see kind of a Jekyll and Hyde type of scenario where this individual really was a very disturbed individual, utilizing burner phones, utilizing alias emails, and of course, obviously, having this desire and this sickness to want to go online and meet these girls and not only meet up with them, but unfortunately, it led to his obviously personality disorder, where at the end of their encounters led to him brutally murdering these girls. And I will not be surprised, and I think it will be played out in the next couple of weeks with respect to him being held responsible for the murders of other individuals.
And I want to get your opinion on some of that evidence. Of course, we know that the pizza crust, according to investigators, is what led to him being identified. They did find some of the evidence, they said, on that victim, and it was connected to him through that pizza crust. I believe this is something that we are hearing about more often because we heard it in the Idaho murders case that has been a big case, very high profile over the last several months. Is this something that is done a lot where you do have agents, law enforcement go out there and collect trash, so to speak, to help make that connection?
Well, what we call in the business is trash pulls. That generally is initiated when we identify what we believe is a viable target or subject. And so the trash pulls were something that happened within the last year when this task force was assembled. What you have seen is that there was DNA evidence that law enforcement had a decade ago. Unfortunately, at that particular time, the forensic science had not caught up with allowing law enforcement to be able to do scientific DNA profiling, which was very successful in the last year. And then coupled with them having what they believed an identification with respect to a vehicle It wasn't too hard then, and basically what law enforcement did is they used the Department of Motor Vehicle in New York State to locate who owned that type of Chevrolet Avalanche, and was able to then use cellular data with respect to location data and then pinpoint anybody in that area. And then, of course, they're working backwards, they're tightening the noose, and then eventually they had a prime suspect. And then you end up pulling trash and then trying to match up potential DNA evidence with those trash pulls with respect to the evidence that was left at some of the murder scenes.
And based on what we learned from some of the court documents, from the news conference that was held with several different agencies involved and the district attorney here, one of the things that we did learn is that Heuermann is accused of using the phone that belonged to one of the victims to essentially call and taunt the family of that victim. I mean, what are your thoughts when you hear something like that?
Well, again, there you have an example of the tenacious detective work that really was involved in this case. You know, people, and, you know, we see it in the drug trafficking trade or the human trafficking trade with respect to quote unquote individuals using what is better known as a burner phone because they believe that a burner phone is not traceable. What people forget is that in order to set up that quote unquote burner phone, you're going to have to establish an email address or some sort of identifiable information. Now, while people may think that they can use aliases, what you saw really, and I think it was a turning point, is that the assets, the investigative assets that have been available with respect to the FBI, when the FBI was brought in a year and a half ago in connection with this task force, that really changed the playing field for local and state law enforcement, and utilizing assets that may not be available on the local level. That was a game changer in connection with this case.
Based on just some of the information that we have learned here, what questions do you still have specifically that you hope could get answered here at some point?
Well, I think that law enforcement obviously is going to continue to conduct searches as they identify physical evidence. I know over the weekend they were executing a search warrant at a storage locker, and assume that they find additional evidence. You're going to continue to follow the evidence until it leads to a logical conclusion. I think ultimately, and I think most of your viewers would want to know whether or not this individual will be willing, and it would probably only come down in exchange to a plea, a negotiated plea, as to whether or not he's willing to talk to law enforcement and basically open himself up to be able to accept responsibility and identify all of the people that he is responsible for killing, and then ultimately leading law enforcement to where other individuals may be that are unknown at this particular time to law enforcement. I think that's the ultimate goal. I think law enforcement obviously wants to give closure to all of these families. Keep in mind that he's only charged with 4 homicides at this particular time. My understanding is that within that same area, they're up to at least 11 individuals. So we have 7 individuals that are unaccounted for with respect to being able to hold someone responsible for their disappearances and their murders.
Do you think there's any questions that are never going to be answered at this point? Anything that we may never know, even as the case does develop, possibly goes to trial? There could be a plea deal, of course, as you mentioned, but is there anything that we may never know the answer to?
Well, I think in this particular case, and I think what will play out is, I think the people that are closest to him, meaning his family members, I think clearly they were aware of his, just his sociopathic behavior, just his disturbed behavior. I don't believe, and I cannot imagine that for this long of a period of time, given living in a house with a wife and at some point 2 kids, that someone was not aware of his fetish or his, his wanting to be with other individuals in the sex trafficking arena, and with respect to using burner phones. I think that's the most shameful and reprehensible part of this case is that, and we see this unfortunately all too often in active shooting type of situations where all of a sudden someone wakes up on a particular day and carries out a horrendous act. And then we find out later on that people around that individual suspected his, his deteriorated behavior. And so I would anticipate that in the weeks and months coming that you will find out a lot about this individual and just people who were aware of his behavior but just decided to turn a blinded eye. And that's a very unfortunate situation.
I want to get your opinion on some of the Google searches that the court documents allege he made. We talked about this a little already, but according to, let's say, Fox News here, Huerman allegedly searched for Mistress Long Island, mature escorts, Manhattan. I mean, what do you make of just those searches and the information that was provided in those documents?
So I'll put my lawyer hat on at this point. And so those searches in and of themselves, and of course, a skilled defense attorney will be able to try to make the argument that there's nothing improper, there's nothing illegal about making those searches. He was just curious, certainly someone who was living in the immediate area. It would not be surprising that someone was interested in staying on top of the advancement of the news cycle in connection with this scenario. However, when you couple that with all of the other circumstantial evidence, and of course now this is not only a circumstantial evidence case, we also have direct evidence. So when you put it all together, it's certainly unfortunately, or it is fortunately for the general public, for their welfare and safety, it is extremely damning to this individual, and it will be more than likely that this case will end up in a plea of guilty and ultimately be punished to the fullest extent of the law.
All right, Stuart Kaplan, thank you so much for taking the time here to join us and help kind of break all of this down for us. A case that is going to continue to develop, no doubt, over the next several days, weeks, months, maybe years here. Is there anything else that you want to add before I let you go?
I would just say that I think this is a perfect example of that we need a national initiative. I know there's been a lot of negative publicity with defunding law enforcement. This is a perfect example where we need the complete opposite. We need a national initiative to fund local police departments in connection with their cold cases. There are hundreds of cases that are collecting dust on someone's shelf that if we could only have the money and resources to pull those boxes down and dust them off, with the advancement of DNA technology, with the advancement of just the assets and investigative tools that are available to law enforcement now, most of those cases can go with a resolution to give those families some type of closure. And I would love for this case perhaps to be the catalyst to get that national initiative funding from the federal government.
Yeah, because when you think about it, I mean, we're talking about murders that happened over a decade ago, and then, here you have an answer, somebody arrested, a suspect charged. Obviously, at this point, still have to go to trial and all of that. But Stuart Kaplan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and help provide kind of your expertise.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.